A 24-year-old man presented to the outpatient clinic for his health insurance checkup. The intern, while examining, couldn't hear the heartbeat on the left side. Could you believe that? Yes, the patient is still alive, but the heartbeat is not found. Then, when examining on the right side, he could find the heartbeat. So, what do you call this condition as? This condition is referred to as dextrocardia. Now, why this has occurred? So for this, we would be looking into the development. Okay, we will be discussing this in several components. So the initial beginning will be taught in today's session. So my name is Dr. Anand Srinivasan, and we will be discussing about the formation of the heart in today's session. So we will be seeing about the heart. These horseshoe-shaped cells, which is called the primary heart field, it lies cranial to the neural crest. So here you can see the neural crest, the neural folds, and the primary heart field is located anterior to the neural crest. You know that the neural crest is the one which gives rise to the brain. So initially the heart is located anterior to the brain. So cranial to the brain. So here you can see this is the forming the neural fold, and the primary heart field is located anterior to it. Now along with this primary heart field, there is a small portion of the intraembryonic xylem which get incorporated, and this is the one which forms the pericardial cavity. The pericardial cavity, it's formed along with the primary heart field, and this pericardial cavity is nothing but a small portion of the intraembryonic cavity, right? So the progenitor heart cells, which are formed in the epiblast, to summarize, so they go through the primitive streak and they lie in the lateral plate mesoderm close to the visceral layer and along the horseshoe-shaped structure cranial to the neural crest, and along with it there will be a small part of the intraembryonic xylem which forms the future pericardial cavity. The primary heart field is the one which gives rise to the parts of the atria and the entire portion of the left ventricle. Now, from the primary heart field, there is a tube which is formed, which is called as the cardiac tube. We will be discussing about this right now. And this cardiac loop is lengthened by means of the secondary heart field. So the secondary heart field, which is also by the vasculogenesis, they extend, the heart tubes are getting extended, and this secondary heart field is the one which gives rise to the right ventricle, the outflow tract, that is the truncus arteriosus, which is nothing but the portion of pulmonary artery and the aorta, and also some parts of the atria. So the primary heart field gives rise to parts of atria and the left ventricle, the entire left ventricle. The secondary heart field gives rise to the right ventricle, the outflow tract, and the parts of atria. The outflow tract is nothing but the truncus arteriosus. Now let's see some of the clinical aspects. The cardiac progenitor cells is one of the important structures, and it establishes the laterality. There are various factors which helps in establishing this laterality, and one of the key chemical which is involved in this is the serotonin. So the serotonin is quite important, and this happens during day 16 to 18. So this is one of the critical period for the development of the heart. And what happens if this serotonin is not secreted? For example, a patient, a mother who is taking one of these drugs, which is SSRI. This is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So in they take this drug, the serotonin levels are coming down. It's one of the antipsychotic drugs. So the serotonin levels come down, and if it falls during this critical period, that's between day 16 and 18, they can lead on to various congenital heart defects like dextrocardia, the one which we have seen right now, where the heart is located on the right side than on the left. ASD, which is atrial septal defect, ventricular septal defect, and double outlet right ventricle. The double outlet right ventricle, which means that both the aorta and the pulmonary artery arise from the right ventricle. So the aorta, instead of rising from the left ventricle, it arises from the right ventricle. So these are some of the cardiogenic effects that can happen if the laterality is not established. Now in this picture, we are seeing the primary heart field. So this primary heart fields, which is in a horseshoe shaped, they get united together to form two endocardial heart tubes. So you can see the formation of the two endocardial heart tubes, and at the same time, from the secondary heart field, there are two dorsal aorta. The dorsal aorta, which is developed from the secondary heart field, so they lead on to the formation of the dorsal aorta, which runs along the entire aspect of the embryo. So these are the dorsal aorta and these are the heart tubes. Now what happens after this endocardial heart tubes? These two endocardial heart tubes come closer together and they get fused to form one single endocardial tube or the heart tube. So this is how the heart tube is formed. So initially there are two tubes. These two tubes, they get united to form one single endocardial tube. Now this endocardial tube is initially attached via the dorsal mesogastrium. It's initially attached through the dorsal mesogastrium, or in this case we can call it as mesocardium. It's attached to the dorsal aspect via the dorsal mesocardium. Now this dorsal mesocardium, then they later on degenerate and they get connected with the entire pericardial cavity, forming the transverse pericardial sinus. So this dorsal mesocardium, they later on get degenerated, forming the transverse pericardial sinus. Right. Now let's see the other aspects in the endocardial tube. Now here you can see the endocardial tube, which is lined by the endothelium. Surrounding this endocardial tube, there is a small layer which comes from the extracellular matrix, and this is called as cardiac jelly because it contains a large amount of hyaluronic acid. So the cardiac jelly, which comes from the extracellular matrix, and the outermost layer, they get modified to form the epicardium. Okay, so the epicardium, which is formed from the outermost layer. Right, so let's summarize this picture. So here you can see initially the primary heart field. So the primary heart field, they get fused together to form the two endocardial tubes. The two endocardial tubes, they fuse together to form a single endocardial tube. Now this one is attached to the dorsal part by dorsal mesocardium. This dorsal mesocardium, they later degenerate, forming the transverse pericardial sinus. The endocardial tube, which is lined by the endothelium, is ensheathed by the cardiac jelly, which is coming from the extracellular matrix, and the outermost layer gets transformed to form the epicardium or the visceral layer of the pericardium. Now we have seen in the first slide that the heart tube is located cranial to the developing brain. Then how does it come towards the thorax? So this is brought to the thorax by means of the cephalocaudal folding of the embryo. So during this cephalocaudal folding as well as the lateral folding, the heart is brought towards the thorax. So here you can see this is the developing brain, the oropharyngeal membrane, that's the future mouth, and this is the pericardial cavity and the heart tube. This is the septum transversum, which later on develops into diaphragm. So during the folding, the cephalocaudal folding, now the brain is brought up. The oropharyngeal membrane is brought below the brain. This is the developing foreguard, and the heart finally comes to rest near the thorax. So this is the oropharyngeal membrane, the future mouth, the heart tube and the pericardial cavity, and the septum transversum. Right? The primitive chambers, that is the atrium, primitive ventricle, bulbous cordus, and the three portions of the bulbous cordus, the proximal, middle, and the distal portion. The follow-up lecture we will be discussing about the development of the sinus venosus and how the primitive atrium is separated into right and left, and the ventricles, how they are developed into right and left ventricles. Thank you so much.